This is New Zealand. It is an archipelago comprised of 2 major islands and a number of smaller islands. It is located in the South Pacific Ocean, southeast of Australia, with an area of almost 103,500 square miles and a population of approximately 4.3 million. New Zealand has one of the lowest population densities at 41 people per square mile. Approximately 86 to 90% of New Zealanders live in cities, so the country is highly urbanized. New Zealand forests have a complex history of interactions between man and nature. Yet people's perceptions of these forests vary significantly from the realities. In this presentation, we will discuss people's perceptions and what shapes them. We will then delve into the realities of what has happened in the forest throughout New Zealand's history and how perceptions affect current forest management. Before we begin our discussion on perception versus reality, I would like you to take a moment to consider how you perceive New Zealand forests. What comes to mind? Now consider what has influenced your frame of mind, what has shaped your perception. Perceptions vary widely from group to group and person to person, and are dependent upon what influences people are exposed to. Many who live outside of New Zealand are influenced by film, television, and travel agencies. These provide partial perspectives because each is working toward its own specific goal. For the most part, people with these influences see the forests of New Zealand as almost pristine and untouched. Films like The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia use the unique New Zealand landscape to portray another world, so it is easy to perceive the forest as untouched by humans.
Skalathon, the heart of elvendom on earth.
Travel agencies or tourism advocates like 100% Pure New Zealand put out films and show photos of tourist activities you can do that will bring you close to nature, but they show very few signs of permanent human presence among the forests. So now that we have explored the perceptions of New Zealand, let's take a look at the history of New Zealand and how that history has affected the forest and landscapes. New Zealand was settled by the Polynesians a little over 1,000 years ago. When the Polynesians arrived, about 85 to 95% of the land was covered with forests. The Polynesians began to make their mark on the land through the use of fire. The Maori burned significant areas of the lowland forest to encourage the growth of bracken fern, which was used as a food source to make cross-country travel easier. Burning was also used as a strategy for hunting moa, a large ground bird. Since settlement, approximately 30 species and subspecies of birds, including the moa, have been eliminated on the mainland of New Zealand, and many others have become rare. The moa was one of the only browsing animals on New Zealand and occurred in the drier forests that were burnt. Most of the forests that survived were wet mountain forests that had never been exposed to browsing until the arrival of the Europeans. Because fires had greater impact in drier regions, some forest types, especially dry inland conifer broadleaf forests, were nearly eliminated, and others were greatly reduced. Pollen evidence shows that deforestation proceeded rapidly once it had begun, and rarely regressed back to forest. Consequently, the remaining forests are not at all representative of the pre-human condition. The next settlers to arrive to New Zealand were the Europeans in the early 1800s. At the time of European settlement, the forest cover had been reduced to 68% of the land surface, and by the time of widespread settlement in the 1840s and 1850s, close to half of the original forest cover had been destroyed. Landholders were required to improve their land, and clearing forests was one way to do that. After World War II, much of the mountain forests were converted to farmland or fast-growing exotic plantations. The majority of the deforested land was converted into urban, horticultural, and agricultural uses, and by the early 1900s, wool production was the dominant form of land use. The net result of Polynesian and European settlement was the reduction of forest cover from 85% to 32% of land cover. The Polynesian and European settlers not only had a direct effect on the landscape of New Zealand through deforestation, but also had an indirect effect through the introduction of exotic species. New Zealand is an island with a large proportion of endemic taxa, and is therefore particularly vulnerable to invasive species. Many invasions do not spread through undisturbed habitat, so human land use and habitat destruction dramatically increases the risk and spread of invasive species. The Polynesians and Europeans introduced many species including feral cats, stoat, possum, rodents, wasps, deer, sheep, and other livestock. Grazing sheep on open fields has become an iconic image of New Zealand, but sheep are actually an introduced species. Invasive species cause problems for many reasons, including changing successional pathways, long-term alteration of ecosystem properties, and the prevention of regrowth of indigenous species. Invasive species are a problem all over the world, but have been particularly devastating in New Zealand. New Zealand now has a greater number of introduced plants than native plant species. Beyond settlers, forest management has also played a pivotal role in the shaping of New Zealand's forests and landscapes. New Zealand has spectacular protected forest areas, so why do people's perception of these areas matter? Many studies have been conducted in New Zealand that have examined the wilderness perceptions held by users of the New Zealand backcountry. Basically, every group agreed that the term wilderness describes extensive size and remote natural environments, but they varied on their ideas of what could be present. The majority of people believe that things like campsites, road access, commercial recreation, hunting, and shelters were acceptable in wilderness environments, while a small group thought that solitude, remoteness, and little human impact were necessary in a true wilderness environment. So this means that the majority of users can get their wilderness experience from less fragile forests that would not typically be classified as a wilderness area. So what does this tell us about perceptions and forest management? Forest managers must maintain areas that suit different people's preferences and needs. Tourism and recreation activities are putting a strain on fragile wilderness areas. So understanding that many people do not need an actual wilderness environment to get their perceived wilderness experience means more of the fragile areas can be protected from these users, and they can get their experience in a less fragile, already altered forest area. New Zealand forests have a complex history of interactions between man and nature, yet people's perceptions of these forests vary significantly from the realities. New Zealand is not the pristine, untouched environment it is portrayed as in films, television, media, or tourism agencies. In fact, it is a much altered landscape from what it was before human influence. The perceptual approach to forest management can be used to give people their perceived experience while protecting fragile wilderness areas. So although perception may differ from reality, perception can be used to improve New Zealand forest management in the future.